It is Monday, May 18th, 1964. Whitsun Bank Holiday. The seaside town of Brighton, normally a picture of genteel coastal repose, is holding its breath. The air doesn't just smell of salt, vinegar, and damp pebbles. It's electric with something else. It smells of petrol, expensive cologne, and cheap amphetamines. Hundreds of parka-clad youths, their identities announced by the chrome-laden Vespa and Lambretta scooters parked in tight formations, flood the promenade. They are the Mods. Facing them, near the Palace Pier, are the others. Black leather jackets, greasy hair, and the low, heavy rumble of Triumph and Norton motorcycles. The rockers. For hours, there is only noise. Shouting, the revving of two-stroke engines, and the jukebox spilling R&B onto the beach. But then, a single deck chair is thrown. A bottle smashes on the asphalt. The press cameras are already waiting. The shock that will define a generation has begun, not as a battle, but as a media event, staged on the pebbles of the South Coast. This was the moment Britain's post-war consensus truly cracked. This moment on Brighton Beach was not born from nothing. It was the product of a Britain struggling to find its identity, caught between the gray, ration book memory of the 1940s and the sudden, explosive promise of the 1960s. To understand the moral panic, one must first understand the profound seismic shift that occurred in British society. The nation that emerged from the Second World War was unified in victory, but also exhausted, impoverished, and deeply conservative. The late 1940s and early 1950s were defined by scarcity. Life was regimented by rationing, by deference to authority, and by a shared social contract that prized community and conformity above individual expression. But by the late 1950s, this world was visibly dissolving. In July 1957, Prime Minister Harold Macmillan told the nation, "Let's be frank about it. Most of our people have never had it so good." He was right. Austerity was ending. The post-war economic boom, fueled by full employment and new industries, was creating a level of disposable income that previous generations could only dream of. And for the first time, this new wealth was flowing directly into the pockets of the young. This was the birth of a new social category, the teenager. Before the 1950s, the concept barely existed. You were a child, and then you were a small adult, expected to work, contribute to the family, and adopt the values of your parents. But now, post-war legislation had raised the school-leaving age. National service, the mandatory military conscription for young men, was being phased out and would end entirely by 1960. This created a unique social space. A generation emerged that was no longer bound by the immediate burdens of war, nor by the expectation of immediate adulthood. They had time, they had energy, and most importantly, they had money. They were the first generation to see themselves as a distinct tribe, separate from their parents. They did not have to save for a mortgage or support a family. They could spend their wages on the three things that would come to define them: clothes, music, and transport. The market adapted instantly. New magazines, new record labels, and new television shows like Ready, Steady, Go sprang up, dedicated entirely to servicing this new consumer. This generation wasn't just living in the culture. They were the culture. They were the bulge, the demographic wave of post-war babies who, by 1963, were coming of age. But this liberation created a chasm. The older generation, the one that had fought at El Alamein and survived the Blitz, looked on with a mixture of confusion and resentment. They saw this new affluence not as a hard-won peace dividend, but as something frivolous, unearned, and even dangerous. This new generation, with its strange music and obsessive focus on appearance, seemed to respect nothing. They were louder, richer, and more visible than any youth that had come before. This generational friction was the dry tinder. The media, itself expanding and desperate for new narratives, was looking for a spark. It needed symbols to represent this confusing new world. It found them in two distinct, opposing philosophies, two new armies of the night that had begun to form in the coffee bars and dance halls of urban Britain. They were, at first, ghosts in the British machine, two tribes defined almost entirely by what they rejected. The first, and in many ways the older, were the rockers. They were the direct descendants of the 1950s Teddy Boys, but they had traded the Edwardian dandy look for something more primal and American. Their icon was not a British aristocrat, but Marlon Brando in The Wild One. The rocker was a creature of leather, denim, and grease. Their uniform was a declaration of allegiance, a black leather motorcycle jacket, often adorned with studs and the name of their idol: Elvis, Gene Vincent, Eddie Cochran. Their transport was their religion. They worshipped the British heavyweight motorcycle, the Triumph Bonneville, the Norton Dominator, the BSA Gold Star. Their entire culture was built around the motorbike, the transport cafe like the legendary Ace Cafe on London's North Circular Road, and the pursuit of the ton, racing at 100 miles per hour. The rocker philosophy was one of sullen, macho individualism. It was a rejection of the mainstream, a self-conscious separation from the cafes, and dance halls of ordinary youth. They were, by 1963, already an anachronism. Their music was 1950s rock and roll, a sound that was being rapidly eclipsed. They were the past, clinging to a rebellion that had already happened. And then, there was the new thing: the mods. The name was short for modernist, a term originally applied in the late 1950s to a small clique of working-class London aesthetes obsessed with modern jazz. But by 1963, the movement had evolved. It had absorbed the sharp, aspirational style of Italy and the revolutionary sound of Black America. The mod was the polar opposite of the rocker. Where the rocker was greasy, the mod was obsessively clean. Where the rocker was brutalist, the mod was narcissistic. Their uniform was a statement of European cool: narrow-lapelled Italian suits, polo shirts buttoned to the top, desert boots or bowling shoes. To protect these expensive clothes from the grime of the city, they adopted the fishtail parka, an American Army surplus item that became their signature. Their transport was the Italian scooter, the Vespa, or the Lambretta. It wasn't a symbol of raw power, it was a design object, a clean sculptural accessory that wouldn't stain their trousers with oil. They customized them, adding dozens of chrome-plated mirrors and racks, turning them into mobile art installations. And their music was the future. They rejected 1950s rock. They craved the new, the obscure, the authentic. They danced to American R&B from labels like Motown and Stax, and the raw energy of Jamaican ska. This was dance music, and it was often fueled by amphetamines, Purple Hearts, that allowed them to stay awake, dancing, for entire weekends. The mod philosophy was one of group superiority. They didn't want to opt out of society like the rockers. They wanted to create their own parallel society, one that was, in their eyes, infinitely more stylish and sophisticated than the greasy rockers or their boring parents. For a time, these two tribes existed in parallel, their paths rarely crossing. A mod in his sharp suit had no reason to visit a greasy spoon transport cafe. A rocker on his Triumph had no interest in an all-night R&B club in Soho. Their contempt was mutual but distant. This was not a war. It was, at best, a rivalry of aesthetics. But the British media, sensing a story in this visual contrast, began to frame it as something more. It was a narrative of old versus new, leather versus mohair, brute force versus feminine vanity. All that was needed was a stage. And in the spring of 1964, they found one. The quiet, respectable seaside towns of the English coast. This sudden, intense focus on the two subcultures was not accidental. It was driven by a fundamental shift in the British media itself. The 1960s saw newspapers locked in a fierce circulation war, desperate to capture the attention of a newly affluent public. The old guard, the serious, broadsheet papers, were losing ground to the racier, more sensationalist tabloids. These papers required stories that were simple, visual, and emotionally charged. The mods and rockers were, in effect, the perfect story. They were a morality play in modern dress. This is Angle One, the media machine. The moral panic was arguably an invention of the press. It began not with a major riot, but with a minor scuffle in the sleepy seaside town of Clacton-on-Sea at Easter 1964. A few dozen youths were involved. Some windows were broken. Some beach huts were vandalized. The total property damage was minimal. In a previous era, it might have made page 10 of the local paper, but the national press, having sent reporters to the coast in anticipation of the bank holiday crowds, descended. The story was irresistible. The Daily Express and Daily Mirror ran front-page headlines speaking of invasions and battles. They used language borrowed from the Second World War, casting these teenagers as a delinquent army laying siege to respectable Britain. Journalists framed the events as organized, premeditated violence between two warring gangs, a narrative that had little basis in fact. More often than not, the groups were simply milling about, bored, until the presence of cameras and reporters and the expectation of a conflict helped create one. They had been told they were at war, and so, eventually, they were. The media provided the script, and the youths, feeling the spotlight, began to play their assigned roles. This amplification had a critical effect. It created what sociologists call a deviancy amplification spiral. The sensational headlines defined the two groups to the nation, but they also defined the groups to themselves. Young, disaffected teenagers across the country read the papers. They saw the sharp suits and the leather jackets. They saw the attention. The media coverage became a recruitment poster. It turned two small, localized subcultures into a national movement, drawing in thousands of new adherents who wanted to be part of this shocking new phenomenon. This media narrative was amplified by Angle 2, the sound of the new. The division between mod and rocker was, at its heart, a division of sound. The rockers were defined by their loyalty to the past. Their music, Bill Haley, Elvis Presley, Gene Vincent, was the sound of the 1950s, a raw, guitar-driven rebellion that by 1964 already felt nostalgic. It was music of raw emotion, direct and uncomplicated. The mods defined themselves by rejecting this. They were musical explorers, driven by a restless hunt for the new. Their sound was the sound of urban Black America. They filled clubs like the scene in Soho to dance to the sophisticated, layered rhythms of Motown, the Miracles, the Marvelettes. They revered the raw, emotionally honest blues of John Lee Hooker and the driving soul of James Brown. And from Jamaica, they imported the syncopated, upbeat rhythm of ska. This music was not just a soundtrack, it was a functional part of the mod lifestyle. It was dance music, and it required stamina. The mod culture was fueled by amphetamines, the lippers, or Purple Hearts, that allowed them to dance all night and ride their scooters to the coast at dawn. This drug use, largely hidden at first, became another point of fascination and horror for the mainstream press. But for the mods, the music and the pills were tools of liberation. They allowed for the all-nighter, a ritual that separated them completely from the 9-to-5 world of their parents. Their music, imported and obscure, was a badge of honor. It proved their superiority. It was a secret code the establishment and the rockers could not understand. Finally, this entire confrontation was played out through Angle 3, the politics of fashion. These were not just clothes, they were ideologies. The rocker's leather jacket was a symbol of rugged, anti-social individualism. It was a uniform borrowed from American outlaws, practical for riding a motorcycle, and deliberately intimidating. It was a rejection of the effeminate mainstream. The mod, in contrast, weaponized style. This was a movement born from the working class, but it aspired to an almost aristocratic level of presentation. The mod was a dandy. He might work in a postroom or a factory from Monday to Friday, but on the weekend, he was, in his own mind, royalty. He spent a disproportionate amount of his wages on a single, tailor-made Italian suit, on imported French polo shirts, on handmade shoes. This obsession with appearance was, in itself, a revolutionary act. It was a form of conspicuous consumption that baffled their parents, who had been raised on make do and mend. Furthermore, the mod style was deliberately androgynous. They wore their hair longer, college boy style. They used cologne. They were, in the parlance of the time, effeminate. This blurring of gender lines was perhaps the most shocking aspect of all to the older generation. It challenged the very definition of British masculinity, which was still rooted in the stoic, rugged image of the soldier and the manual laborer. Carnaby Street in London became their temple, the first street in the world dedicated entirely to men's fashion. When the mod put on his suit, he wasn't just getting dressed. He was signaling his rejection of his parents' world, his class, and his expected future. This potent combination, a sensationalist media, a revolutionary new sound, and a politicized new style, set the stage for the bank holiday weekend that would define the era. The tribes had been established. The battle lines had been drawn by the press. All that was needed was the definitive confrontation. The stage for this cultural drama was as significant as the actors. This brings us to Angle 4, the seaside battleground. The confrontations were not happening in the industrial cities or the sprawling London suburbs where these youths actually lived. They happened, almost exclusively, in traditional, quiet, seaside resorts: Clacton, Margate, and most famously, Brighton. There was a simple, practical reason for this: the bank holiday. In 1960s, Britain paid leave was not generous. The long weekends of Easter and Whitsun were the only real opportunities for working-class teenagers, flush with wages but constrained by the 5-day work week, to escape their homes. The seaside town was the traditional destination for a British holiday. It was a place of family, of elderly couples, of fish and chips and pier-end amusements. This made it the perfect backdrop for the establishment's shock. When the mods and rockers invaded these towns, they were not just breaking the law. They were desecrating a sacred space of British tradition. The image of a mod in a parka kicking over a striped deck chair, or a rocker's motorcycle roaring down a promenade meant for quiet strolls, was a powerful visual metaphor for the new generation's assault on the old. This new generation was mobile in a way their parents had never been. The scooter and the motorcycle were not just accessories. They were engines of liberation. Hundreds of youths could now coordinate and descend upon a single town, creating a critical mass that felt to the small local police forces like an occupying army. The towns were unprepared. They had no experience with this phenomenon. The youths, for their part, were often simply bored. They arrived in huge numbers, with no organized entertainment, and found themselves in a town that viewed them with suspicion. The tension, the posturing, and the inevitable small-scale scuffles were a predictable result. This leads to the most critical perspective, Angle 5, the folk devil. Decades later, the sociologist Stanley Cohen, who was present in Brighton during the events, would give this phenomenon its name. In his landmark study, Folk Devils and Moral Panics, he analyzed exactly what happened in 1964. He argued that the panic was not a rational response to a real threat. The actual violence was minimal. The danger was almost entirely fabricated. Instead, Cohen argued, mods and rockers became folk devils. They were a visible, easily stereotyped group onto whom society could project its deepest anxieties. The older generation was terrified, not of a few broken windows, but of what these youths represented: the collapse of deference, the rise of an affluent working class that no longer knew its place, the erosion of traditional British values, and the confusing new landscape of sexuality and consumerism. The media, by sensationalizing the events, created these devils. But they were aided by moral entrepreneurs, politicians, police chiefs, and local magistrates who had a vested interest in amplifying the threat. By condemning the mods and rockers, they were seen to be taking a stand for decency and order. They called for harsher penalties, more policing, and a return to short, sharp shock punishments. This response was wildly disproportionate to the actual events. It was a societal immune response, an allergic reaction to change. The youths themselves were caught in this loop. Vilified by the press and condemned by the courts, their sense of group identity only hardened. They were told they were outlaws, so they began to act the part. The mods and rockers became the first, and perhaps the most iconic folk devils of the post-war era. They were the scapegoats for a nation that was profoundly uncomfortable with its own future. All of these abstract forces, the media war, the musical divide, the clash of styles, and the sociological panic, were about to converge on one specific place, at one specific time. The events at Clacton over Easter had been the dress rehearsal. The Whitsun Bank Holiday in Brighton, May 1964, would be the main performance. This would become the Second Battle of Brighton, the moment the moral panic reached its absolute climax. The Whitsun Bank Holiday weekend of May 1964 was not the beginning of the conflict, but its apex. It was the moment the media narrative, the sociological tension, and the youthful energy converged with explosive force. The town of Brighton, with its long pebble beach and twin piers, became the unwilling stage. Thousands of young people began arriving on Friday, May 15th. The press, anticipating a repeat of the Easter scuffles at Clacton, was already there. Reporters and photographers took up positions in seafront hotels, their cameras trained on the promenade like artillery. This, in itself, changed the dynamic. The youths were not just arriving for a holiday. They were arriving to an audience. The police were also prepared, but in the wrong way. They expected organized gangs. What they got was a sprawling, chaotic, largely disconnected mass of teenagers. By Saturday, estimates placed over 1,000 mods in the town, and several hundred rockers. They occupied different territories. The rockers congregated around the transport cafes and the amusement arcades of the Palace Pier. The mods, more numerous and exhibitionist, claimed the beach and the streets around the lanes. For 2 days, the tension was thick but largely non-violent. It was a carnival of posturing. Scooters were revved in unison, a two-stroke chorus against the throaty growl of the triumphs. Groups would march down the promenade, chanting, only to be met by a line of police officers who would simply move them on. The media, frustrated by the lack of a battle, reported on the insolence of the youths, their outlandish clothes, and the fear of the locals. The flashpoint, as it so often is, was minor. On Sunday afternoon, on the beach near the Palace Pier, a group of mods began taunting a smaller group of rockers. Insults were exchanged. It escalated. A few deck chairs, the quintessential symbol of seaside peace, were grabbed and thrown. Pebbles were scooped from the beach and hurled. This was the signal. Photographers, who had been waiting for 3 days, sprinted towards the scuffle. The sound of running feet, of police whistles, and the first shouts of, "It's happening," created a panic. Other groups, hearing the commotion, ran to join in, not out of malice, but out of a desire not to miss the main event. The police, seeing the groups converging, moved in to make arrests. This was interpreted by the youths as an attack, and the crowd turned its resentment on the officers. The battle was, in reality, a series of brief, chaotic, running skirmishes. It was not a pitched battle between mods and rockers. It was, more accurately, a fragmented riot of mods against the police, with a few rockers caught in the middle. The fighting was amateurish and theatrical. Deck chairs were the primary weapon. The Palace Pier's windows were smashed. A few youths broke through the police cordon and ran along the pier, chased by officers. The most iconic images of the entire era were captured in these few hours. A young mod, suit still immaculate, being hauled away by 2 burly policemen. A rocker, defiant on his bike, surrounded. A crowd of youths surging past a terrified elderly couple. These photographs were on the front page of every national newspaper the next morning. The headlines screamed of Bedlam, Riot, and The Battle of Brighton. The reality on the ground was less of a battle and more of a chaotic adolescent outburst. The property damage, while shocking to the town, was not extensive. The weapons confiscated by police were largely innocuous. A few chains, some knives, but mostly just the debris of a seaside town. But the perception was one of open warfare. The media had its story. The nation was convinced that its seaside towns were under siege by a new, violent, and uncontrollable generation. By Monday morning, the town was saturated with police reinforcements from across Sussex. The atmosphere was no longer festive. It was grim. The police, embarrassed by the Sunday chaos, adopted a zero-tolerance policy. They began arresting youths for the smallest infractions, obstruction, minor speeding, or simply insulting behavior. The battle was over, but the cleanup and the recriminations were just beginning. The final arrest count from the weekend was 76. It was this legal proceeding, the official establishment response, that would cement the moral panic in history. The shock of the bank holiday weekend now moved from the breezy promenade to the stuffy confines of the Brighton courthouse. This was the second, and perhaps more significant act of the drama. The youths who had been arrested, 76 of them, were processed in a spectacle of summary justice. They were no longer just teenagers. They were the embodiment of a national threat, paraded before a legal system that was entirely unprepared for and utterly baffled by them. The courtroom was a circus. Reporters from the national press packed the galleries, their notebooks ready. The local magistrates, men of an older generation, were visibly appalled by the defendants before them. They were not hardened criminals. They were young workers, shop assistants, mechanics, and apprentices, many still in their teens, now facing the full, theatrical wrath of the establishment. The man who would give a voice to this outrage was Dr. George Simpson, the chairman of the Brighton magistrates. His words, delivered on Monday, May 18th, as he sentenced the first wave of offenders, would become more famous than any of the violence that preceded them. Dr. Simpson did not see bored teenagers. He saw a diseased swarm. He looked down at the parka-clad youths, some of whom were still nursing minor injuries, and he delivered a judgment that was less a legal ruling and more a cry of cultural disgust. He famously described the defendants as inarticulate morons and vermin. He spoke of them as internal enemies of the nation, implying their behavior was a kind of domestic treason. But his most quoted and most revealing condemnation was this: "These long-haired, mentally unstable, petty little sawdust Caesars. These are the type of people who would have been loyal followers of Hitler." This was the climax of the moral panic. It was a staggering, almost hysterical statement. In a single sentence, the magistrate had linked teenage fashion, long hair, and minor public disorder with the genocidal fascism that Britain had fought a world war to defeat just 19 years earlier. It was a profound insight into the mind of the older generation. They could only comprehend this new, self-obsessed, and insolent youth by framing it as a familiar, existential evil. The sentences handed down were just as disproportionate. Youths were fined heavily, 50 or 75s, at a time when the average weekly wage was around 18s. These were crippling sums, intended to be punitive, but the most shocking sentences were the custodial ones. Several youths were given 3 months in prison for their part in the riots, sentences of a severity that stunned the courtroom. The press, of course, reported every word. The Sawdust Caesars and Vermin headlines were printed nationwide. Dr. Simpson's speech did not calm the situation. It canonized it. It provided the official stamp of approval for the media's hysteria. It confirmed to the nation that, yes, this was a crisis. Yes, this was a threat to the very fabric of society. This moment in the Brighton court was the turning point. It solidified the image of the mod and rocker as folk devils. But it also had an unintended consequence. By handing down such harsh, dramatic judgments, the establishment had made martyrs of the youths. The prison sentences and the vermin tag became badges of honor. The courtroom drama confirmed to the mods, in particular, that their culture was so powerful and so new that the old world could only react with fear and incomprehension. They had, in their own minds, won. They had proven that the establishment was terrified of them. The shock was mutual. The Battle of Brighton was over. The arrests had been made. The sentences passed. But the cultural shockwave was just beginning to radiate. The immediate aftermath would see not a decline in these subcultures, but their explosive entry into the mainstream, changing the face of British music and fashion forever. The immediate effect of the Brighton court cases was not the one the magistrates intended. The short, sharp shock did not cow the new generation into submission. It did the opposite. It cemented the mod identity as the definitive dominant youth tribe of 1960s Britain. The media, having created the folk devils, now sought to understand them. And in doing so, they put the mod, not the rocker, at the center of their lens. The mod was articulate, photogenic, and obsessed with the new. The rocker was sullen, backward-looking, and associated with the greasy 1950s. The press, and by extension, the nation, picked its winner. Suddenly, mod was the most fashionable word in Britain. The very things Dr. Simpson had condemned, the long hair, the androgyny, the obsession with clothes, were embraced by the mainstream. Carnaby Street and the King's Road became global tourist destinations. The sharp Italian suit, the parka, and the desert boot moved from subcultural uniform to high fashion. Music was the clearest vector for this takeover. A new generation of bands, many of whom had been part of the mod scene themselves, now codified the lifestyle. The Small Faces, with their sharp suits and R&B-infused pop, became mod icons, but it was The Who provided the definitive artistic statement. Their lead guitarist, Pete Townshend, famously described their music not as pop, but as pop art. They were a reflection of the mod aesthetic, clean, loud, disposable, and obsessed with maximum impact. Their 1965 anthem, My Generation, was a direct response to the condescension of the establishment. The line, "Hope I die before I get old," was the ultimate rejection of the world personified by magistrates like Dr. Simpson. The Who didn't just play for the mods, they were the mods. Years later, they would create the ultimate monument to the era, the 1973 rock opera Quadrophenia, a complex, nostalgic look back at the 1964 bank holiday riots, framing them as a moment of adolescent angst, tribal belonging, and profound disillusionment. While the mod identity was being celebrated, packaged, and sold to the world as swinging London, the rocker identity faded. Cast as the villains, the greasy losers of the seaside battles, their numbers dwindled. Their 1950s music was completely eclipsed by the British invasion sounds of the Beatles, the Kinks, and the R&B-driven mod bands. The leather jacket and the Triumph motorcycle, once symbols of rebellion, now just looked dated. The rocker tribe didn't die, but it retreated, becoming a niche interest, a small bastion of 1950s nostalgia in a world that was racing towards the psychedelic future. The moral panic had, in effect, acted as a massive, free advertising campaign for the mod lifestyle. It had taken a localized, working-class subculture and broadcast its style, its music, and its attitude to every corner of the nation. The establishment had tried to condemn it, but in doing so had only proven its cultural power. The vermin had won. They hadn't just shocked the system, they had become the system. But the legacy of 1964 was more profound than just fashion and music. While the mod style was being celebrated on top of the pops, the mechanism of its notoriety was being studied. The real, lasting impact of the seaside battles was the creation of a blueprint, a social template for how older generations would process their fear of the new. This was the template that sociologist Stanley Cohen defined as the moral panic. What happened in Brighton and Clacton was not a singular event. It was the test case for a pattern that would be repeated again and again for the rest of the 20th century. The pattern was now set. First, a new youth subculture emerges, visible through its distinct style and music. The media seizes upon this group, isolating its most shocking elements. They are labeled as a threat to public order, decency, and the British way of life. They become the folk devils. Next, the moral entrepreneurs, the politicians, the police chiefs, the judges step in. They use the media coverage as proof that a crisis is underway. They make speeches, like Dr. Simpson's, condemning the new threat. This justifies a crackdown, more policing, harsher sentences, and public denunciation. This, in turn, amplifies the very behavior it seeks to stop. The targeted group, feeling vilified and misunderstood, leans into its outsider identity. The deviant label becomes a badge of honor. The media reports on this reaction, and the cycle spirals, feeding itself until the public is in a state of genuine, if misplaced, panic. This exact template, forged in the spring of 1964, was immediately reused. Just a few years later, the folk devils were no longer mods, but hippies. The panic was no longer about beach fights, but about drug use, sexual liberation, and the rejection of work. The media ran sensationalist stories about LSD, communes, and the permissive society. In the 1970s, the template was applied with even more venom to the punks. The Sex Pistols, with their ripped clothes, safety pins, and anthems of anarchy in the UK, were the perfect folk devils. They were banned from venues, condemned in Parliament, and famously attacked in the streets. The panic was the same. Only the soundtrack and the fashion had changed. The events of 1964 were, therefore, a kind of sociological year zero. It was the first time that post-war Britain, as a mass media society, had to confront a generation that did not share its values. The response was not understanding, but fear. The moral panic became the establishment's primary tool for managing social change. It was a defense mechanism, a way of controlling a future that seemed to be slipping from their grasp. The mods and rockers were simply the first to be fed into this machine. Looking back from the vantage point of a new century, the moral panic over the mods and rockers seems almost quaint. The violence was minor, the shock a theatrical performance. The deck chairs and broken windows of Brighton in 1964 pale in comparison to the profound social upheavals that were to come. The strikes, the protests, and the political turmoil of the 1970s. But to dismiss it as mere youthful exuberance is to miss the point. The real shock of 1964 was not the sound of a jukebox being thrown through a cafe window. It was the sound of a social contract being torn in two. For centuries, British society had been built on a foundation of deference, the unquestioning respect of the young for the old, the working class for the gentry, the people for the establishment. The mods and rockers, in their own chaotic and often inarticulate way, were the first generation to publicly withdraw that respect. They were a generation born in the shadow of a war they did not fight, and they refused to be defined by its grim, gray austerity. They were the first to have their own money, their own music, and their own style. When they invaded the quiet seaside towns, they were asserting their right to exist, to take up space, to be seen and heard. The panic that ensued, the vermin speeches, the sawdust Caesar headlines, was the sound of an old Britain failing to understand a new one. The establishment wasn't truly afraid of a few teenagers on scooters. It was terrified of what they represented, the irreversible loss of its own authority. The mods and rockers were not a political movement, but their legacy was profoundly political. They were the first cracks in the post-war consensus. They were the advance scouts for the cultural revolution that would define the rest of the 1960s. They proved that the future would not be a quiet continuation of the past. It would be loud, it would be stylish, and it would be utterly, unapologetically new.